The hospital air usually smelled of floor wax and exhaust fumes, but that night it smelled of ozone and impending rain. I was filling out charts in the control room when the glass doors didn't just open, they seemed to explode. Inward as a group of men in tactical gear stormed the place, carrying a man whose presence was like a gravitational force. The silence of the night shift shattered instantly. They weren't waiting for a triage nurse, they were a wall of muscle and urgency, moving with synchronized military precision that screamed confidential. At the center was him, a Navy SEAL, his uniform torn and soaked in a deep, dark red that looked black under the fluorescent lights. The head paramedic, a man with eyes as cold as stone, didn't look at the attending physician. He looked directly at me and fired off a single sentence that made the room freeze. "She's the person on the patient list." I hadn't even taken a step forward yet, but they knew exactly who I was, which sent a rush of pure adrenaline through my veins. As we rushed the stretcher to Trauma Room 1, the chaos seemed orchestrated, almost like a rehearsed play where I was the only one who hadn't seen the script. Doctors were being blocked by a man in a dark suit who appeared out of nowhere, while I was dragged into the epicenter of the storm. The soldier, nearly unconscious, reached out, trembling with shock, and gripped my wrist with a force like a vice. He pulled me close, his breath smelling of copper and salt, and whispered a sequence of 6 numbers followed by a name I hadn't heard since my childhood in the Midwest. It wasn't a medical request, it was a code. When I looked down to check his vital signs, I saw a small silver coin pressed into his palm, engraved with a symbol that matched a medallion I'd kept hidden in my locker for 10 years. My heart stopped. This wasn't just a patient. He was a bridge to a past I'd tried to bury, and his arrival meant the quiet life I'd built there was officially over. If this story has already captivated you, subscribe to the channel right now, because what comes next will surprise you even more. I also want to know where you're watching from today. Leave a comment below. My name is Elena Vance, and before sirens and secret codes defined my existence, I was just a girl from the Chicago suburbs trying to make a difference in the medical field. I spent years working in hypersure environments, but I moved to this quiet little town in Virginia in search of peace, or so I thought. The man on the table teetered between consciousness and unconsciousness, his grip on my wrist finally loosening as the sedative took effect. The doctors were frantic, but I was focused on that silver coin. It bore the insignia of a unit that officially didn't exist. I felt the weight of the men in the hallway. The way they stood guard wasn't to protect the hospital, but to contain the man inside that room. My pulse pounded in my ears as I began to cut through his tactical vest. Beneath the Kevlar and the blood, I saw something that took my breath away. It wasn't just a wound. It was a surgical scar, perfectly horizontal, right over his heart, with a small, bright blue light beneath the skin. This wasn't just a soldier. He was a prototype, a living experiment brought to my emergency room because I was the only one who knew how to keep a secret. I remember my father talking about things like this in a low voice when he thought I was asleep. He was a veteran who never completely detached himself from the battlefield, and seeing that soldier was like looking at the ghost of my father's untold stories. The intrigue of that military presence in my routine ward began to attract a crowd of curious colleagues, but the men in suits soon moved away. I felt a profound sense of responsibility wash over me. I wasn't just his nurse, I was his guardian. Each beep from the heart monitor felt like a clock ticking away, a countdown to the moment I would have to choose between my career and the truth. The city of Richmond seemed distant now, even though it was only a few miles away. There, in that sterile room, a different kind of war was beginning, and I was on the front lines. Thank you for sticking with me this far. This shows that you feel the same way I did going through all of this. So subscribe now and turn on notifications, because what happens now changes everything. The atmosphere in the hospital shifted from medical emergency to high-stakes espionage within an hour. Men in dark suits, claiming to be from a department I'd never heard of, began isolating the entire East Wing with impressive and terrifying efficiency. My supervisor, usually a tough woman who could stand up to even the most hardened surgeons, was pale and refused to look me in the eye as I passed her in the hallway. I realized then that I wasn't just a nurse tonight, I was witnessing something they couldn't let out of those walls. I went to the break room to splash cold water on my face, trying to process the code the SEAL had whispered. It was my father's old service number, a man who had been reported missing in action 20 years ago in a jungle on the other side of the world. The intrigue was so thick it was suffocating, and the gossip among the staff was already spiraling out of control. They whispered about a helicopter crash and a mission gone wrong, but I knew it was something much deeper. I sat there for a moment, staring at my reflection in the stained mirror, thinking about my life there. I had moved to this city to escape the noise, to live a quiet life where the only drama was a difficult patient or a night shift. But now, the silence of my new life was being torn apart by a ghost from my past. As I walked back to the trauma unit, I noticed one of the military guards watching me with a strange intensity. He didn't look like the others, who remained motionless like statues. He seemed restless, his eyes fixed on the security cameras. He seemed to be waiting for me to make a move, or perhaps he was waiting for an opportunity to talk. When I passed him in the narrow corridor near the pharmacy, he bumped into me on purpose. In that instant of contact, he dropped a small folded piece of paper into my uniform pocket without saying a word or stopping. My heart raced, and I felt the weight of that paper as if it were made of lead. Now I want to know from you, where are you watching this report from? Write in the comments. It's incredible to see people from so many places following stories like this. I locked myself in a supply closet, surrounded by the smell of sterile gauze and antiseptic, just to have a few seconds of privacy to read the note. It contained only 4 words written in hurried, jagged handwriting. Trust no one here. The ink was still fresh, and the message hit me like a physical blow. A shiver ran down my spine as I realized the true extent of the danger I was in. Returning to the patient's side, I had to perform a standard dressing change, but my hands trembled so much I could barely hold the forceps. Removing the blood-soaked bandages, I saw more than just the bright light beneath his skin. Around his neck, tangled in monitors and wires, was an identification tag, but the name on it wasn't his. It was mine, Alina Vance. My heart pounded against my ribs like a bird trapped in a cage. How could a man I'd never seen, an elite soldier from a secret unit, be wearing a tag with my name on it? I began to realize that my entire life in this city, my work at this hospital, and even my sudden decision to move from Chicago might have been orchestrated by forces I couldn't even name. I was no longer just a nurse providing care. I was a piece on a chessboard, and I didn't even know which side I was on. As I was about to tuck the tag under my hospital gown so I wouldn't be seen by the cameras, the Cecil's eyes suddenly snapped open. They were no longer clouded by medication. They were clear, penetrating, and filled with a sharp, terrifying intelligence. He gripped my hand with surprising firmness for a man in his condition, and whispered, "They're not here to save me, Alina. They're here to eliminate me. And now that you've seen the light, they're going to eliminate you too." The gravity of his words hung in the air, heavier than the lead aprons we wore in radiology. I glanced at the security camera in the corner, wondering if they were listening to every word. Have you ever been through something similar, where you had to hide the truth or remain silent to protect yourself? The rest of the night was a whirlwind of tense maneuvers and muffled whispers. Whenever a doctor or government agent entered the room, the SEAL feigned unconsciousness, his breathing becoming shallow and regular, as if in a drug-induced deep sleep. But the instant we were alone, his behavior reverted to that of a predator on high alert. He began to give me rapid instructions in a low, hoarse voice. He told me about a hidden facility deep in the Blue Ridge Mountains, a place where soldiers were enhanced with experimental technology that the general public would only see 50 years later. He was a deserter, a man who had seen the utter darkness behind the curtain and decided to flee before completely losing his humanity. The controversy of what he was telling me was striking. If this information reached the public, it wouldn't just be a scandal, it would topple governments and change the definition of what it means to be human. As I listened to him, I felt a strange and terrifying bond forming with him. It was a connection born of shared danger and the haunting ghost of my father's legacy. I began to notice things I had previously ignored, the way the hospital lights seemed to flicker whenever he became agitated and how the electronic monitors malfunctioned if he touched them. The suit-clad intruders were growing more aggressive by the minute, demanding his immediate transfer to a private facility under the guise of national security. I knew, with agonizing certainty, that if he left with them, he would never be seen again. He would become just another missing person, like my father. I had to make a choice that would define the rest of my life: follow the hospital protocol I had respected for 15 years, or become a fugitive to save a man who held the key to my own identity and my family's secrets. I looked out the window at the rain-soaked streets, knowing my world was about to be reduced to ashes. The weight of the silver coin in my pocket felt like a burning ember against my thigh as I walked through the sterile white corridors of the hospital. Every nurse I passed, every doctor who offered a weary greeting, seemed like a potential informant for the men in dark suits. I began to reflect on my life in Chicago, the long hours in the emergency room, the cold wind from Lake Michigan, and the feeling of always running from something I couldn't name. I moved to Virginia seeking refuge, a place where I could simply be a nurse, free from the haunting memories of my father's disappearance. But, watching the armed guards near the elevators, their hands hovering over their holsters, I realized I had fallen straight into a trap set 20 years ago. The city of Richmond, with its history and secrets, was now the scene of a life-or-death struggle that felt more like a spy movie than a medical shift. My professional life was built on the foundation of the Hippocratic Oath: do no harm, but, as I watched the general's men prepare a heavy transport stretcher with reinforced straps. I knew that doing no harm could mean breaking every rule in the hospital manual. The conflict within me was becoming physical. My stomach churned, and my breath was short as I entered the small break room to gather my thoughts for a moment. I thought about the cafeteria gossip, the nurses already speculating about the secret soldier in Trauma Room 4. They had no idea that the man they were gossiping about was the key to a global conspiracy that could rewrite history. I remembered a specific moment from my childhood. A day my father called me aside for a talk and told me that sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is remain silent when the world cries out for answers. That memory solidified my resolve. I was no longer just Alina Vance, the quiet suburban nurse. I was the protector of a truth that could destroy the entire world if it fell into the wrong hands. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 3 in the morning, the hour when the world is quietest and the most dangerous decisions are made by those who have nothing left to lose. At 3:15 p.m., the soldier, the Navy SEAL, fully regained consciousness for a brief lucid moment. The bright blue light beneath his skin seemed to pulse in sync with his heartbeat, casting a ghostly ethereal hue onto the hospital sheets, making the situation all the more surreal. He looked at me, not as a patient looks at a nurse, but as a comrade looks at an ally in the midst of a losing battle. In a voice as hoarse as crushed stone, he began to confess the truth about the mission that had brought him to my door. It wasn't a standard operation or a routine patrol. It was a rescue mission gone terribly wrong at a facility that didn't exist on any official map. He told me about the others who hadn't survived, men who were now more machine than human, stripped of their memories, their families, and their basic identity. The emotional impact of his words was devastating. I could see the pain in their eyes, a deep sadness for their brothers in arms who were lost in a government project that treated elite soldiers as disposable parts. The details he shared were almost unbelievable, but looking at the strange surgical scars and the name tag with my name on it, I knew every word was the pure and simple truth. He explained that the code he whispered was part of a security sequence my father had helped develop. Before his mysterious disappearance, my father wasn't just a soldier. He was the chief scientist of the program. This man was now trying to expose to the world. The revelation hit me like a punch to the gut, making the room spin and my legs buckle. Everything I thought I knew about my family was a lie, created to protect me from this moment. The SEAL gripped my forearm, his eyes burning with despair. Alina, they're coming for the data stored inside me. If they get it, your father's work will become an unstoppable weapon. You need to help me get out of here before the sun rises in this building. I could hear the heavy boots of the transport team echoing in the hallway and knew our time for conversation was officially over. Tensions reached a breaking point when the transport team, led by a man with a jagged scar on his chin, stormed into the emergency room without warning. They had no transfer papers or medical clearances. They carried high-caliber weapons and exuded an aura of absolute authority that ignored all hospital protocols. I stood firm, my heart pounding in my chest, and physically blocked the path to the stretcher. This patient is not stable enough to be transported, and I did not authorize his release, I said, my voice surprisingly firm despite the absolute terror coursing through my veins. The man with the scar laughed, a cold, joyless sound that sent shivers down my spine. He approached, hand on his holster, and said my medical opinion was no longer needed or welcome. The controversy unfolded before the entire night shift staff, who watched from the nursing station with wide, frightened eyes, sensing that something terrible was about to happen. I felt the weight of the silver coin in my pocket again, a reminder of the legacy I was now forced to bear. I looked at the SEAL, who remained completely still, his eyes closed as if he were dead or heavily sedated. But I noticed the slight tension in his jaw, the way his muscles were contracted like a spring, ready to snap. I knew he was waiting for my signal, trusting me to navigate around the civilian obstacles. I realized then that I was the one who truly controlled the room, not the armed men. I had access to the hospital's internal systems, the electrical grid, and the emergency mechanisms they hadn't even considered. I made a split-second decision to create a distraction that would give him the opening he needed. I reached for the emergency alarm on the wall, but before I could activate it, the general entered. He seemed sculpted from granite, his presence alone enough to silence the entire room. He didn't look at the soldiers. He looked directly at me with a gaze that seemed to probe my soul. "Nurse Vance," he said, his voice deep and menacing, "you are interfering in a matter of national security. Step aside now, or you will be treated as an enemy of the state." The general's threat hung in the air like a thick, suffocating fog. I looked at the SEAL, then back at the general, and realized that if I turned away, I would be complicit in the erasure of a human life and the true story of my father. I chose a different path, one that would change my life forever. Instead of turning away, I leaned over the patient as if to check his dressing one last time, and in one fluid movement, disabled the main power supply to the entire ward using the emergency code the soldier had whispered to me earlier. The hospital plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. The emergency generators, which normally kicked in within 5 seconds, had been blocked by a digital bypass I had installed minutes before, under the guise of routine maintenance. In those few seconds of total chaos, the room became a moving shadow play. I felt the SEAL movie was a blur of silent, lethal movement, even in his weakened state. Muffled blows could be heard, the thud of weapons falling to the ground, and the panicked screams of the transport team, who were completely blind in the darkness. I felt a hand grasp mine in the darkness. It was warm, firm, and secure. Go to the parking lot. Level 3. The SEAL whispered directly in my ear. Find the blue sedan. The keys are under the seat. Don't look back. Alina, whatever you do, don't look back. Before I could answer, he was gone, moving through the darkness as if he were part of it. When the emergency lights finally came back on, flickering with a sickly yellow glow, the room was completely destroyed. The general stood by the shattered window, his face a mask of pure, utter fury as he stared out into the rainy night. The bed was empty. The restraints had been cut with surgical precision. The general turned to me, his eyes half closed, and asked where the patient was. I stood there, covered in the dust of the chaos, and felt a strange, new sense of peace. I looked him straight in the eyes, felt the weight of the silver coin in my pocket, and told him with absolute conviction that I hadn't seen anything. I was no longer a victim of history. I was the one holding the pen. In the weeks that followed that terrible night, the hospital returned to a disturbing normalcy, but I was a different woman. I resigned, citing burnout and the need for a fresh start. But the truth was, I was waiting for a sign I knew would eventually come. I moved to a small, isolated cabin on the outskirts of the state, living as off-grid as possible and keeping my eyes on the horizon at all times. I spent my days wandering the woods and my nights studying the old journals my father had left behind, journals that finally made sense now that I had seen the technology behind them. One night, as the sun set behind the mountains, a package arrived at my door with no return address or stamp. Inside was a single photograph of my father, young and vibrant, next to the same SEAL who had died bleeding in my emergency room. On the back, a single sentence was written in the same jagged handwriting: "The mission continues. Alina, and you are the key we've been waiting for." That's when I realized my life as a nurse, in a quiet little town, was just the introductory chapter to a much larger and far more dangerous story. My name is Alina Vance, and I no longer hide from the shadows of the past or the secrets of the government. I seek the truth they tried to extract from a hero in Trauma Room 1, and I won't stop until the world knows what they're doing in those secret facilities. The silver coin is now a necklace I wear every day, a constant reminder that some secrets are worth dying for, and that some people are worth everything to save. I gaze at the mountains every morning, knowing that somewhere out there, the soldier is waiting, and my father's legacy is finally within my reach. My life is intense, surprising, and full of nuances I could never have imagined when I first donned my nurse's uniform in Chicago. The last whisper wasn't an end, it was a beginning. What do you think really happened to the SEAL and my father? Do you believe that the truth is always worth the risk, even if it means losing everything you knew? Leave your opinion in the comments below. Your opinion is important to this community of seekers. If you were moved by this journey, subscribe to the channel and join our family. Each new member strengthens our voice against the silence. Also, be sure to watch the next recommended video. The secrets get even deeper and more shocking from here on out.